Amen. Thank you, Jesus. All right, well, good evening. I want to welcome everyone again to our service tonight, both those here in the room as well as those that are streaming with us online. So tonight we're going to continue on with the history of modern Israel, part 11. And tonight's title is The Prelude to the Six-Day War. So there's enough stuff in between. We're actually not going to get to the war tonight. But just thinking in the context of it all, if you remember, when I started, it's really around the fight that's going on in the heavenlies, right? So you have, the demons and all that are just, full of hate, hating Israel, hating Christians, all that. And this, I think, is one of those times where you can really see that, in coming into play. And you see a lot of that stuff that's happening to Israel during this time. It's also important to understand the context of the world at this time, too. When we talk about late 50s, early 60s, already in the Sinai campaign, Britain, had to, basically stop fighting, go back home because of the threats that Russia was giving it. And so Britain had really gone down on the world stage. And we're left with the two great superpowers of the time, the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union. And there's all the type of conflict between them. You talk about Europe, they had the Eastern Bloc, the United States had NATO, there was conflicts in Korea, there's conflicts in Vietnam, and there's also the things in the Middle East. And Israel at first, the Soviet Union was supporting it in the United Nations because it thought it had a chance to have Israel be a communist country. But when it didn't go that direction and started getting more Western help, still with Britain and France and the United States, Russia really changed its tune on that and was really then started supporting more of the Israel's enemies or people around that time when it realized it wouldn't be part on its team. So it's kind of like you're either for us or against us. There's no neutral ground type things going on. So that's the context. Again, this starts after the Sinai campaign. And we're going to start, with the United Nations. And a woman named Golda Meir, who was a foreign minister, she actually later in life became the first woman prime minister of Israel. But she was at the time the foreign minister. And she addressed the UN General Assembly, really urging the Arab leaders to come to the table and make a real peace settlement. Because there was still just an armistice after the Sinai campaign. And she was, trying to, push peace at that time and say, look, we really should be there living together in peace. But Egypt's President Nasser responded that Israel was just trying to deceive world opinion and that his country would never recognize the Jewish state. So it's already setting up, against it and the intolerance that was going on there. So in 1963, the Arab League formed the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was from the remnants of the Fedayeen. If you remember, that's where Egypt was sending in terrorists all around the Israel, trying to create chaos there. And so they reformed basically as the PLO, and Yasser Arafat at the time became the first PLO leader. They created at the time the first version of the Palestine National Charter. It's been updated a few times since that time, but its charter called for the destruction of Israel. It did not recognize any of the claims that the United Nations had put about their history there or any of the people that had lived there for a long time. Instead, it was just intent on wiping that out and having the whole of Palestine just for Arab people. They performed hundreds of terror attacks against Israel's citizens. Again, many of these things were going in from the Jordan area, even though they were a lot of times Egyptian operatives. The reason for that was because Egypt and Jordan were still vying for to be the leader of the Arab League. And so Egypt was trying to undermine Jordan by sending people in through that area, so Israel would retaliate against Jordan and try to undermine the king of Jordan at that point too. But that caused lots of tension even between the members of the Arab League by their activities. And eventually, King Hussein of Jordan basically removed their PLO offices because he couldn't control them, and they would still do things he did not want. Even though he was against Israel, they were still putting more attention upon him. Then in Morocco in 1965, the Arab League met to discuss the problem of Israel. That's the way they described it. And they were basically making war plans. The king of Morocco, King Hassan II, not to be confused with the king of Jordan, which was King Hussein of Jordan, but the king of Morocco didn't really trust the Arab League at the time. And thought they were working against a lot of what the Arab League was. Now, Morocco, if you don't know, that's on the kind of that northwest coast of Africa. So it's a couple of countries over from where the Middle East is. So on the other side, like Egypt's on one side, Morocco's on the other. But so he didn't trust a lot of the leaders, and so he secretly recorded the conversations that were happening there, and he shared them with Israeli intelligence. So it gave them a heads up of what the plans were, what they were trying to do with starting the war, and all that. And it really showed that there was really no unity among the Arab states. Again, if we go back to when Israel was founded and the war of their independence, each of them had their own objectives, and they were not fighting in unity at all. And it shows even these almost 20 years later, they still were not fighting together. They were still trying to vie against one another. Syria saw the other things happening, and they wanted to get in on the action as well. And so Syria had a geographical advantage over Israel, and that on the border is an area called the Golan Heights. And it's a few thousand feet higher than across the Jordan River to where Israel was. And so they'd start shelling Israel from the Golan Heights because they had that height advantage. And so the people that were in that area, they had to get used to sleeping in bomb shelters and all at the time, and it kept on coming. This came up in the United Nations, in the General Assembly. There was some resolutions calling for the stop of it, but the Soviet Union vetoed all of those. And instead, they turned around and started condemning Israel for retaliating against Syria for bombing them, which is kind of a weird juxtaposition of it. But again, it just shows the demonic activity that's going on, trying to justify bombing another country on there. Egypt still, they were instigators on a lot of the previous Sinai War, and the president there was still just doubling down. He had his rhetoric saying, "We shall not enter Palestine with its soil covered in sand. We shall enter it with its soil saturated in blood." And he then declared publicly the Arabs' aspiration, saying the full restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people. In other words, we aim at the destruction of the state of Israel. The immediate aim, perfection of Arab military might. The national aim, the eradication of Israel. So it went on, and then in 1967, in May, Nasser ordered the UN emergency force to leave the Sinai Peninsula. Now, this was it's the United Nations emergency force that was put in place after the Sinai War to kind of have that buffer between Egypt and Israel. It also, the United States had made sure that the Straits of Tiran was kept open. And all this was supposed to go before any changes. This was supposed to go before the UN General Assembly. But when Nasser ordered them to leave, the Secretary General at the time just obeyed without bringing it up, and they left within a couple of days. And so they just removed their entire force without having any discussion in the United Nations about it. Voice of Arab Radio proclaimed at the time, "As of today, there no longer exists an international emergency force to protect Israel. We shall exercise patience no more. We shall not complain any more to the UN about Israel. The sole method we shall apply against Israel is total war, which will result in the extermination of the Zionist existence." And then right after that, Nasser then again closed the Straits of Tiran to Israel and set up that blockade again. And a couple other quotes I just wanted to do from the time there too. The Syria defense minister stated, "Our forces are now entirely ready not only to repulse the aggression, but to initiate the act of liberation itself and to explode the Zionist presence in the Arab homeland. The Syrian army, with its finger on the trigger, is united. I, as a military man, believe that time has come to enter into a battle of annihilation." The Iraq president said, "The existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map." And then the Egyptian president added, "The Jews threaten to make war. I reply, welcome. We are ready for war. Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel. Today, the issue is not the establishment of peace between the Arab states and Israel. The war with Israel is in effect since 1948. And again, just shows, all the things that were happening. And there's really no question about these things. These were public statements that were made. These are facts in the matter of what happened at the time. And people can try to spin it and they can try to justify it, but this is really the call for genocide of what was happening in all these states that were going around and calling the war. And so what did the world do? Again, it looked to the Soviet Union and to the United States to see what was happening. And the Soviet Union basically started planting false information around. They would tell a lot of the Arab countries at the time certain things that they were saying Israel was doing, which was not. And the intent of that was to try to provoke them further, because Russia wanted to create instability in the region. They wanted to create the war, wipe out another supposed ally for the West. They also provided weapons and logistics to each of the Arab League countries. Meanwhile, President Johnson expressed the regret that the Straits of Tiran blockade happened, stated it was illegal, and then tried to go through diplomatic means to stop that. But the Egyptian president wasn't hearing any of it, and he didn't budge at all. And so all the diplomacy basically stopped at the time. Johnson did state, "Israel will not be alone unless it decides to go alone," on its side. And then when war started, the U.S. State Department then just announced, "Our position is neutral in thought, word, and deed." And then once that happened, the Arab countries at the time were then stating that all of your stuff, you'd supplied Israel with the weapons, and they were claiming the U.S. was continuing to supply Israel with weapons. And so then the president imposed an arms embargo on the entire region. So not just Israel, but they're saying we can't deal arms any of the Arab states either. But it basically left Israel all alone. It was basically saying it's not going to come for help. It's not going to put out any other things on diplomacy, and all the other Western countries, basically followed the United States' lead. Even the France When the embargo happened, it was they were kind of pressured into also embargoing or not doing any other weapons. And so if we go back to it, we're right at that moment where Israel's alone. And that's where I think we see God doing the work. And we will get into some of that next time when we talk about the actual war. Okay.